From Buried in the Sky by Peter Zuckerman and Amanda Padawan. Hanging off the face of a cliff, an ice axe the only thing between him and death, a Sherpa climber named Churing Dorji swung to the left. A massive ice boulder ripped off above him, hurtling toward him. It was the size of a refrigerator. The underbelly caught and the mass flipped, cartwheeling down. It tore past, skimming Churing's shoulder, then vanished. Broof! It slammed into something below, shattering. The mountain shook with the impact. Powder shot up in a column. It was about midnight on August 1st, 2008, and Churing had only a hazy idea of where he was. On or near the bottleneck of K2, the deadliest stretch of the most dangerous mountain. At roughly the cruising altitude of a Boeing 737, the bottleneck stretched away from him into the darkness below. In the starlight, the channel seemed bottomless as wisps of fog slithered into the abyss. Above, a lip of ice curled like the barrel of a crashing wave. Oxygen depletion had turned Churing's mind to mush. Hunger and exhaustion had broken his body. When he opened his mouth, his tongue froze. When he gasped for breath, the moistureless air scoured his throat and lashed his eyes. Churing felt robotic, cold, too tired to think of what he'd sacrificed to get to K2. The Sherpa, mountaineer, who had summited Everest 10 times, had been consumed by the mountain for decades. A far more difficult peak than Everest, K2's summit is one of the most prestigious prizes in high-altitude mountaineering. Churing had gone despite his wife's tears, despite the climb costing more money than his father had made in 40 years. Despite his Buddhist Lama warning him that K2's goddess would never tolerate the climb. Churing had made it to the summit of K2 that evening without using bottled oxygen, vaulting him into an elite group of the most successful mountaineers. But the descent wasn't turning out as planned. He had dreamed of the achievement, a heroic reception, even fame. None of that mattered now. Churing had a wife, 2 daughters, a thriving business, and a dozen relatives who depended on him. All he wanted was to get home alive. Normally, descent would be safer. Climbers usually go down the early afternoon when it's warmer and daylight shows the way. They rappel, leapfrogging off the ice while attached to a fixed line to control their speed. In avalanche-prone areas around the bottleneck, climbers descend as quickly as possible. This cuts exposure time, minimizing the chance of getting buried. Getting down fast was what Churing had depended on. Now it was black and moonless. The fixed lines had vanished, severed by falling ice. Turning back wasn't an option. Without rope to catch him, Churing had only his axe to arrest a fall. And more than one life was in play. Another climber was hanging from his harness. The man suspended below him was Pasang Lama. 3 hours earlier, Pasang had given up his ice axe to help more vulnerable climbers. He had thought he could survive without it. Like Churing, Pasang had planned to rappel down the mountain using the fixed lines. When the ropes through the bottleneck disappeared, Pasang had figured it was time to die. Stranded, he was unable to climb up or down without help. Why would anyone try to save him? A climber who attached himself to Pasang would surely fall too. Using an ice axe to check the weight of one mountaineer skidding down the bottleneck is nearly impossible. Stopping 2 bodies presents twice the difficulty, twice the risk. A rescue would be suicidal, Pasang thought. Mountaineers are supposed to be self-sufficient. Any pragmatic person would leave him to die. As expected, one Sherpa already had. Pasang assumed Churing would do the same. Churing and Pasang were on the separate teams. Churing had no obligation to help, but now Pasang hung 3 yards below him, attached him to Churing's harness by a tether. After dodging the block of ice, the 2 men bowed their heads and silently negotiated with the mountain goddess. She responded a few seconds later. The sound was electronic, the amplified pluck of a rubber band through distortion pedals. Zoing! It continued, echoing louder, longer, faster, lower pitch from the left, from the right. The climbers knew what it meant. The ice around them was calving. With each zoing, fractures zigzagged across the glacier, ready to drop cinder blocks of ice. If the men sensed one coming, they could shuffle to the side and contort themselves away. Failing that, they could sustain a hit. But eventually, a mass the size of a bus would break off. Not much to do when that happens except pray. Turing and Poisson had to get down before the falling ice crushed them. Chuck! Turing hacked his axe into the ice. Shink! He kicked, stabbing the ice with his crampons. He descended like this for a few feet. Chuck! Shink! Shink! Chuck! Shink! Shink! And cramped himself against the slope so that the man attached to him could move to the same rhythm. Poisson punched the hard ice with his fist, trying to compact it into a dent he could grip. Shallow and slick, the hold couldn't bear his weight. As Poisson extended his leg downward, he leaned on the safety tether that tied him to Turing. Shink! Poisson kicked in his crampons, relieving the pressure of the tether. The weight of the rope threatened to pry Turing off the mountain's face, but he managed to cling on as they maneuvered through the bulges, cracks, dips, and lumps. Sometimes he and Poisson went side by side, holding hands, coordinating their movements. At other times, Poisson went first, while Turing braced in a holding position with the axe and controlled the safety tether between them. Rocks and chunks of ice spun at them, digging their helmets, but they were halfway down and they thought they survived. The night was wineless, minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, almost warm for K2. The lights of high camp were smoldering below. Turing and Poisson didn't expect it to happen. A chunk of ice or rock knocked Poisson in the head. Battered off the ice, he swung like a piñata. The force of Poisson's body on the rope peeled Turing from the slope. The men tore downward. Turing gripped his axe with both hands and slammed it into the mountain. The blade wouldn't catch it. It cut surgically through the snow. Sliding fast, Turing heaved his chest against the adze of his axe, digging into the slope. No good. Turing fell faster. Another 7 yards, another 10 yards. Poisson punched the slope with his fists and tried to grip, but his fingers skated along the ice. The men dropped farther into the darkness. Their shrieks, muffled by snow, must have funneled up the bottleneck to the southeast face, but the survivors heard nothing. They were deaf to the thud of falling bodies. All of them were lost, dazed and hallucinating. Some wandered off route. Others calmed themselves enough to make a measured decision between the two grim options: free climb down the bottleneck in the darkness, or bivouac in the death zone. Gerald MacDonald, 2 hours before, had become the first Irishman to summit K2, cut a shallow ledge to sit on and another to brace his feet. Patience wouldn't stop an avalanche, but at least he had a perch to wait out the night. Another climber, an Italian named Marco Confortola, squished in beside him. To stay awake, they forced themselves to sing. With hoarse voices, the men crooned the songs they could remember, anything to avoid dying in their sleep. Earlier, a French summiteer had made a promise to his girlfriend. "I'll never leave you again," Hugh D'Abate had told her via satellite phone. "I'm finished now. This time next year, we'll all be at the beach." That night, he slid down the bottleneck to his death. His Pakistani high-altitude porter, Karim Meherban, stayed off route. Reaching the crown of the glacier that hulks over the bottleneck, he slumped down and waited to freeze. Further down, a Norwegian newlywed had lost her husband to several tons of ice. This climb had been their honeymoon. Now she was clawing down the mountain without him.